That's right, Jane. There's been a lot of talk at the United Nations about how to combat terrorism, but some would say a great deal of that talk is not translated into action. Now, in the aftermath of 9/11, you might recall, there was a great deal of optimism that at last the UN was going to finally crack down on terrorism. Days after the strikes at the Twin Towers and elsewhere, the United Nations passed a binding resolution condemning terrorism and beefing up its efforts to combat its global war on terror. The UN even established a special counter-terrorism committee that would help individual countries in the fight against terrorism. And more recently, the UN Secretary General has said that terrorism, in his words, can never be justified under any circumstances. The international community must continue to fight. But despite all the tough talk, the resolutions, and at least a dozen international conventions here at the United Nations, critics say the organization's efforts have been a failure. And they say the problem here is that the United Nations simply cannot reach an agreement on what specifically defines terrorism. UN critics say the deadlock on a definition essentially undermines what the UN is doing to combat the problem.
If the United Nations cannot even agree on a single definition of terrorism, there is absolutely no prospect at all of the UN playing a constructive role in fighting international terror.
So what specifically is the problem? Well, it comes down to this. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That's why most Islamic countries, which comprise nearly a third of the UN's member states, often refuse to condemn violent acts committed by groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, although both are listed as terror groups by the US State Department and several European countries. And Syria's UN ambassador, he has a unique perspective, his own perspective. He tells Fox that his country has its own definition of terrorism.
We have to distinguish between combating terrorism and the right of people under foreign alienation and foreign occupation to combat foreigners and foreign occupation for the achievement of their right to self-determination.
Now, in the next few weeks, terrorism is going to again be discussed here at the United Nations. Specifically, they're going to be focusing on the root causes of terrorism, a worthwhile topic. But Jane, conspicuously absent from the agenda is any further discussion again of defining exactly what terrorism is.
Jane? That's strange. David Lee Miller at the UN for us. Thanks, David.